What makes a dramatic plot twist actually work? Well, one, it has to make sense. When all the pieces are put together and you're able to step back and look at the full puzzle, you should be able to tell yourself, aha, I get it. That makes sense. It was right there the whole time. How did I not put it together until just now? At the same time, it also needs to be something that has enough dramatic twist to actually mean something. If you find out that the dramatic twist was just that somebody was left-handed instead of right-handed, but that doesn't really impact anything on the plot, then it's not that important. So obviously you just do the same thing in Dungeons & Dragons, and that's how you get your players to go, oh, okay, cool. Well, no, because what they don't mention is that in D&D, when your players notice something out of place, they have the ability to break the entire dramatic pacing of the entire story in order to focus on that instead of actually just moving forward, which means that they will constantly pick at things until they find out the twist long before it happens. Long story short, a story is really focused on making sure that the pacing is correct. You have to keep things moving forward, you have to keep the audience interested, you have to keep things feeling cohesive, but Dungeons & Dragons doesn't require that, which means that at any point, your players have the ability to totally halt the progress of the story to focus in on things. This means that in a story, while the characters might try super hard to actually figure out something, but the movie just kind of glosses over it and says that they can't solve it, the players have, in real life, several hours at a time to try and figure out your plot twist. Also, they have agency. They don't have to follow the pacing of the story. They can continue to focus on clues until they've put it all together. There are so many memes out there about DMs being scared of note takers, and there's a reason why. Note takers have the ability to go back and look at everything and put the pieces together long before you figured out how to make the twist. So how do you make it happen? How do you make a dramatic plot twist happen in D&D and feel good, punchy, make it feel like it makes sense, while also not being so obvious that the players figure it out long beforehand?
Who could have done this? The butler.
Do you honestly expect?
It's not easy, but it is possible. The first thing that you have to do is you have to know how to drop the clues without them catching the player's attention. And you have to drop the clues in a way that the players are going to remember, but not focus on too much. And that's extremely difficult unless you know how to use humor. See, one of the things you have to understand about storytelling is you have to know that everything needs to make sense for it being there. Chekhov's gun is the idea that if there's a gun hanging on the wall in the first act, by the third act, it should have been fired. What it basically means is that if there's something in the story, it needs to have a reason to be there. It's the same thing with D&D, but it gets a little more vague because obviously you're going to want to world build and your players have the ability to explore anywhere. So at that point, you have to figure out what exactly is okay to put in the story and what's just there as fluff, just to add a little bit of flavor. But the players then have the ability to focus in on anything that you add. Oh, you described a barrel of rice in the corner a little bit too vividly than the rest of the things? Well, the players are going to assume that you're communicating to them that that barrel is important. Therefore, in order to actually introduce a dramatic plot twist, or at least the clues to a plot twist, you have to put it in the story in a way that makes sense, nobody questions why it's there, but it's strong enough to remember, and that's why humor is important. The best way to drop a clue to a plot twist is to add it in a joke, because a joke, you know why it's there. The joke is there to be funny, to be humorous, to add some levity. Nobody questions why a joke was added into a story. It's just there, something to entertain the party or the audience or whatever it is you're doing.
Aquarium property! Stop him! Better do what he says. He's a whale biologist.
And so, when you add something into a joke, it means that nobody questions it and you can call back to it later. The problem is if you do this too often, now your players know to watch out for your jokes. And suddenly, anytime you try and make a joke, they're gonna assume that the NPC in front of them is about to betray them at some point or another. It is a very tenuous relationship to make sure that your players understand that they can actually trust you as the DM to not betray them, but also will enjoy the plot twist. That is part 2 of this, by the way. You have to know how to drop the clues to the plot twist, but you have to make the plot twist feel rewarding. It has to be something that is actually exciting and not just a genuine screw you to the players.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
What I mean by this is imagine that you've been setting up a plot twist that one of the main NPCs is actually a big bad villain that's going to betray them. A lot of people really enjoy those types of plot twists and really try to make sure that they work. But what if they don't? What if it is just not exactly what you're looking for in the first place? Maybe your players genuinely love this NPC, and by the time it actually betrays them, it takes all the fun out of the story because they had based most of their emotional arcs on the story, on the character itself. Now, for some groups, that would be amazing because it allows the ability to add a lot of dramatic tension, weight, and stakes. But some groups don't want that kind of plot twist. And so when you introduce that, what you've communicated to them is you better not ever find yourself attached to an NPC again because I am going to hurt you with them. And it creates this constant back and forth of whether you will ever trust the DM. This is why a plot twist requires you to understand what your players are playing the game for. I one time introduced a plot twist in my game that I felt was kind of underhanded, but I did it for a reason and it really worked well with my players, but I don't think it would have worked well with all players. See, my players were in a Lich's dungeon and they were traveling through it. They managed to, over the course of time, actually kill the Lich in one round. I've had so many people ask me how I allowed that to happen, but let me make it clear, I allowed it to happen, one, because I had an assassin rogue and a shadow sorcerer that snuck up on him and unloaded everything they had into him, which, like, if you guys look at the base Lich stat block, he doesn't have a lot of health. He can go down in one round if he's not aware of what's going on. But two, my players were playing into their character strength. They were both supposed to be sneaky assassins, and so I allowed them to do that. However, I then introduced a plot twist when they found out that he was actually a Lich, because they didn't know so beforehand, and he had a phylactery. That was one plot twist, and I had introduced plot points up to it that made that a plot twist. However, they then tried to find the phylactery, couldn't, had to go ask one of his servants what had happened to it, and here we introduced number 2 plot twist. Earlier in the adventure, they've been traveling up this mountain to get to the Lich's lair, and they had to avoid an ancient white dragon that was flying above. As they get to the servant and they ask him what's going on and where is the phylactery, the servant ends up telling them, if you had a very precious magical item that you wanted to keep protected, what would you do with it? Where would you keep it? And suddenly it clicked in the players' minds. The white dragon's lair. And yes, while this did give the dragon some control over the Lich had actually enchanted the item to not appear to be a phylactery, so the dragon had no idea. This was a plot twist that made sense, but for some groups, it probably would have been a problem. Because what they did was they went and they totally vanquished a Lich by their own means and skills and strengths. And then what happened? The Lich ended up just not being killed because of the phylactery, and they were told, yeah, well, you killed one boss and now you have to go fight another in the white dragon. Screw you. That would have been a problem, but not for this group, because they wanted a boss fight. And yes, they got to play into their strengths and kill the Lich, and that was super cool, but they still wanted their big epic confrontation. That was one of the things the group most looked forward to. And now they were able to have it because it was what they cared about. This is what I mean when I say you have to understand what your party wants in order to introduce a plot twist. If your characters really care about drama and stakes, then yes, please go ahead and actually portray them with that NPC. Don't do it again, or at least if you do, make sure you're handling it tactfully, because it will come across as very underhanded if you're not careful. But at the same time, you are making sure that it is something that the players care about. A plot twist must be something that cohesively works with the story. Bad plot twists can totally wreck your campaign. Imagine a plot twist in a movie where things just didn't really work or make any sense whatsoever. Anytime you watched a story where suddenly at the end of the story it turns out it was a dream all along, that's a bad plot twist. Even if you did probably see some sort of clues to it, at the end of the day, what it did was it conflicted with the story because it told the whole story and then told you, sorry, that story didn't even mean anything. It was pointless. It conflicts with the narrative. However, there are some stories that actually play into this. The point of the story was that it was all a dream, that it was all meaningless. Something like The Wizard of Oz. It was so insane, so crazy, and ultimately the point of the story was that Dorothy just wanted to experience a world elsewhere, and she got to. So that made sense. But you can go to other stories and other different episodes of TV shows where at the end of the day it was all just a dream, and it just conflicts with everything because it doesn't make sense. This is why a plot twist has to make cohesive sense with the narrative that you're telling, or it's gonna fall flat.
For Desrin Thane vanishes. And there standing in his place is a gently floating male drow with short hair.
No. Oh! He's a traitor? He's a
So we've talked about how to make sure that you've properly played into the clues that will lead up to the plot twist, while also making sure that the plot twist is not going to remove any dramatic tension from the players. But now that you've done all that, how do you actually enact the plot twist? How do you lay it all out? Because D&D is interesting. You have dice rolls, you have improv, people could talk out of session, out of character. It creates this really interesting thing where the dramatic plot twist can actually happen out of the session. I've had before where I had my players sitting around the table and they were going through their notes and they figured out the plot twist before their characters, and it was just as dramatic. Because what happened was they all looked at each other. They looked across the table, their eyes widened, and they realized, and now they had to play with this sort of dramatic irony sort of thing. Their characters didn't know the plot twist, but they did. And so they had to lead forward knowing that their characters were falling into a trap. But what choice did they have? That is a fun way of doing it. You just have to understand that the dramatic plot twist has to happen in a way that makes things interesting. It doesn't have to happen in character, out of character, or any in between. It just has to make things more interesting. That's the point of a plot twist, to change the status quo and to keep the story moving forward in a new, exciting light. The moment things begin to become too straightforward, a plot twist is the perfect thing to create more intrigue, because narratives are not interesting unless you don't exactly know what's going to happen next. Now, there are some caveats and exceptions to this, but for the most part, that is what makes a story interesting. And that is what you should do and utilize to make the best plot twist possible. A huge thank you to the YouTube members, without which this video wouldn't have been possible. An extra special shout out to BKBW, Corey Wood, Big D the Cool Guy, Ace Pizza Guy 22, Stormsaw, Emily Mares, and Agile Monk for subscribing at the Role Slayer tier.